when you talk about media literacy, it's kind of huge. For instance, I'm thinking if one, because there's so many untrained eyes out there, if they don't understand the font style, once they see the brand on that particular story online, some of them just share it before they even know, before they get to ask you, wait a minute, is this story really from you guys?
Yeah.
Have you had that kind of experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, the brand is so important, that you stay with the brands that you trust, whether that would be channels or whether it would be BBC News, BBC Hausa, BBC Pidgin, our international news services. It's important. Brands are a good way of seeking out the news that you really trust. Of course, they can be faked, but I think if you choose your news on the basis of somebody you already know is trustworthy, that's a good way to do it.
What about these platforms, the chat platforms? Is there any help coming from them, the WhatsApps, those who organize or own those platforms?
So the BBC obviously talks extensively to social media partners, and we work quite closely with the companies, with Google and Facebook, who own a lot of these chat apps. But I think what you mentioned earlier was that a lot of them don't see themselves as news publishers. They haven't actually set out to be news publishers, but audiences find a way to share news in whatever way they see fit. And it's always a race for news publishers and regulators, if you like, to catch up with how young audiences in particular are using new technologies to share things. So I think we'll always be watching to see what our audience are doing and taking our news and putting our news out there. So if you've got something like, now you might use your smartphone and an app to get the BBC Hausa news service, whereas before you might have listened to it on shortwave radio. Those audience changes will happen very quickly. And I think for all broadcasters, yours and for mine, we have to just respond really quickly.
Do you think there's a room for intergovernmental collaboration, relationship to try to ensure that countries where fake news is emanating from doesn't get to other countries and hurt them?
I think there's room for countries to learn from each other's experience, whether it's about effective regulation or whether it's about spotting and calling out different types of fake news. So I think one of the things that the BBC is doing is trying to, we use our language services, broadcasting in different languages around the world, including here in Nigeria, to spot different types of fake news. So not even the specific stories, but to say, like your VT with the faking up a video of somebody talking, we've called out stories where there have been fake pictures, people using false photography to tell stories, or again, these stories where people have faked up BBC News content. We see different types of fake news emerging every time, and it's really important that we make people aware of that, because then they could spot them in their own market, whether that was in Ghana or in Kenya or in India, for example.
This is going to be huge, because if a story emanates from the BBC and it goes as far as, who knows, different continents. So how do you play catch up with this kind of scenarios? I'm just wondering, because it goes very fast, sometimes even weeks before you know.
Yeah, of course, and that's one of the great things about digital news, is it can respond really quickly. It's news at the speed of light rather than at the speed of printing a newspaper. But the downside of that is that if something is wrong, it can spread very, very quickly. And I think here, somewhere here like Nigeria, where you've got elections coming up, there's a lot of concern about people using the elections to spread malicious stories. I think the BBC sees itself as playing a really big role next year in making sure that malicious fake news is not spread in the Nigerian elections, for example.
So what kind of practical steps has the BBC taken, for instance, because regulation, the laws differ from country to country. So how do you ensure that governments don't cross the line from media self-censoring themselves, and the government just being overbearing?
Yeah, so I mean, our main role is as a broadcaster. We're not a regulator, we're not a governance advisor. We want to get the news stories out there and to encourage a debate here in Nigeria, which is our single largest audience of any country in the world. So we've got 34 million people a week consuming BBC News in Nigeria. We're delighted to be such an important partner and player in the country. But we want to use the news content that we are doing to provoke debate here in Nigeria, and for you guys to discuss yourselves what the right solutions are. So we'll continue to sort of pose the questions, to tell you what we've learned globally about fake news and disinformation, and then it's for people in Nigeria and the government and your own industry to decide what the best way to respond.
Any successes so far in terms of how the BBC has been able to work, particularly tackling stories that had gone weeks ahead of time, and then upon knowing about this, you acted and got results?
Yeah, I mean, we saw, you know, as I say, in the last year's elections in Kenya, we saw this faked up video news story
About the nuclear...
from the Focus on Africa. Yes,
oh,
but
okay.
also, yes, indeed, the nuclear confrontation video where someone had produced what was a corporate training video in the BBC News style, saying that there was a confrontation between Russia and the West.
Yeah.
And actually not maliciously, but just kind of unintentionally, that had spread all around the globe. And within about a week, we would just had to come out and say this is wrong, because sometimes we're reluctant to draw attention to things to give them more credibility. But in this case, that was a potentially very damaging story that we had to say, this may look like BBC News, but it's not. And I seem to spend more and more of my time, you know, dealing with things like that. It's becoming a big issue for us.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing how all of this works. Are you having any particular plan or program?
Yes, so we're recording a global debate program. We're recording global questions here in Lagos for TV and for radio. It will be broadcast at the end of the month. And the question we're asking is whether, you know, young African audiences want to see change and how they can affect that political change. It's a big deal for us to be here doing live programming on top of the additional investment we've made in journalism in Nigeria in the last year and a half. We've opened a new bureau here in Lagos with 200 new journalists, with our new language services in Igbo, Yoruba and Pidgin language, as well as the existing services in Hausa and in English. So we have a really, really strong relationship here in Nigeria. It's a delight for me to be here and to be making this special programming this week.
How much of an impact do you think it will have if networks were to put up some sort of caveat saying, look, if you feel there's any news out there that is not from us or from us and misleading, call this number or get across to us?
Yeah, I think you could do that. You could have a national tip line if you want. We rely on people telling us. Often people just send us screen grabs of content saying this is a fake BBC News story. That happens a lot in African countries, happens a lot in India to us as well. So I think there's absolutely, if you see something that you're not happy with and that you think it's a fake, the best thing to do is to report it via another news organisation that you trust, or the news organisation that is being faked, if you like.
All right then, so this is a huge battle for all of us to tackle. We appreciate you coming on this morning. Jamie Angus is the Director of BBC World Service Group. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you, thanks for having me.
All right then, we will be back in a moment. Don't go away.